She had her back pressed against a concrete wall, 4 men closing in, and not a single person in sight. Derek Vaughn saw it the moment his headlights swept the garage, and every instinct he had spent 15 years training came flooding back in one cold second. He was a former Navy SEAL, a widower, father with his 10-year-old daughter sitting in the back seat. And he had exactly 3 seconds to decide what kind of man he still was. Before we go any further, if stories like this speak to something in you, something real, please take a moment to subscribe to this channel and hit that like button. Drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I'd love to know how far this story has traveled. Now stay with me, because this one doesn't go where you think it will. The apartment building at Calverton Heights wasn't the kind of place where things happened. That was the point. That was precisely why Derek Vaughn had chosen it. 3 years ago, when he was still sorting through the rubble of a life that had fallen apart, his wife gone, his daughter frightened and grieving, himself hollowed out in ways he didn't have language, for he had walked through 8 different apartment buildings in 4 different neighborhoods before settling on this one. It wasn't the amenities. It wasn't the school district, though that mattered. It was the quiet, the unremarkable quality of the hallways. The fact that neighbors nodded and moved on and didn't ask questions about the shadows under your eyes, or the way you sometimes stood at the kitchen window at 2 in the morning, staring at nothing. Calverton Heights was the kind of building where a man could disappear without anyone noticing, and at that particular point in Derek Vaughn's life, disappearing had felt like survival. He was 37 now, and he had gotten good at it. The morning routine was precise. Wake at 5:15, make coffee, check on Sadie, spend 40 minutes in the spare bedroom he'd converted to a home gym hitting the bag and doing pull-ups until the noise in his head quieted down. Then breakfast, school drop-off, his job as a private security consultant work he'd carved out of his SEAL background, without ever talking about where that background came from, and pick up at 3:30, homework, dinner, Sadie's bedtime at 9. He was in bed by 10:30. He did not date. He did not socialize beyond what politeness required. He had 2 friends from his SEAL years who called occasionally, and he kept those conversations short. He told himself this was discipline. Most days, he almost believed it. Sadie was 10 years old and had inherited her mother's gift for seeing through things. She had her mother's dark eyes too, that same quality of stillness that could make a person feel observed from a great depth. She didn't ask her father about his past the way other children might badger. She had learned early that there were rooms in Derek Vaughn that the door stayed closed on. But she watched him. She registered things. And sometimes, in ways he hadn't fully calculated, she maneuvered around his edges with a gentleness that unsettled him more than any direct confrontation could have. She was the only person alive who still had that kind of access to him. He intended to keep it that way. The woman across the hall had other ideas, though she hadn't announced them. She hadn't announced much of anything, and that, Derek had noticed despite himself, was part of what made her different. Natalie Carrington had moved into 4B 8 months ago, and Derek's first impression formed in the 60 seconds they occupied the same elevator on her move-in day was that she was someone who took up exactly the space she needed and no more. Not the aggressive compactness of someone trying to seem smaller. Not the performance of ease. She was simply there, present, carrying a box of books with her forearm muscles working and a strand of dark hair across her cheek that she didn't bother to push back. "You're 4A, she said. Not a question. Yeah. He'd pressed the button for their floor, which she'd already pressed. Natalie. She shifted the box to one arm and extended her free hand with the pragmatic confidence of someone who'd long since stopped waiting for other people to initiate. Derek. I'll try not to be a terrible neighbor. He hadn't known what to say to that, so he'd said nothing, and she hadn't seemed to need him to. The elevator opened. She went to her door, he went to his. That had been that, except it hadn't quite been that. Over the following months, he found himself attuned to small things he had no reason to be attuned to. The sound of her heels in the hallway she kept irregular hours, sometimes leaving before 6, sometimes not coming home until 9 at night. The way she said good morning, like she actually meant it rather than deploying it as social lubrication. She laughed easily, genuinely, in a way that didn't perform itself. She had a habit of carrying 2 cups of coffee when she left in the mornings, and Derek had spent a longer time than he'd admit wondering who the second one was, for before concluding it was probably just for later. She was a CEO. He'd gathered that without asking. Sadie had asked her directly in the elevator one afternoon. Sadie had inherited none of his restraint in that regard, and Natalie had said yes. She ran a technology company called Carrington Systems, and when Sadie had pressed for details, Natalie had explained it in terms a 10-year-old could follow without condescending to her. Derek had stood in the corner of the elevator watching this and felt something move in his chest that he immediately classified as irrelevant. He was good at that. Classification. Containment. He'd had a lot of practice. The night it changed was a Tuesday in October. It had been a long day on both ends. Client meeting had run 3 hours over schedule. Sadie's teacher had called in the afternoon about a project deadline. Sadie had quietly been avoiding, and by the time Derek picked his daughter up from the after-school program at 6:15, they were both carrying the specific fatigue of a day that had asked more than it gave. They stopped for takeout on the way home because Derek didn't have the bandwidth for cooking, and Sadie didn't argue, which told him she was tired too. She was quiet in the back seat, picking at the hem of her jacket and looking out the window at the October dark coming down over the city. "Dad," she said, somewhere around the 3rd traffic light. "Yeah. Do you think Miss Carrington cooks dinner or orders out?" He caught her eyes in the rearview mirror. She had that particular look, the one that meant she was building towards something, and was using a tangential question as the first brick. "No idea," he said. "She's probably busy. She works a lot." "She does. It's hard to cook when you work a lot and live alone." "Sadie, I'm just saying. I know what you're saying." She looked back out the window. "I was just thinking about dinner." He let it go. He was good at letting things go. The underground garage at Calverton Heights was accessed through a side alley, a ramp that curved down under the building and opened into 2 rows of concrete pillars and fluorescent strips that buzzed more than they illuminated. The building management had been promising upgraded lighting for 7 months. It was still on the list. Derek had noted this as a security liability the second week he lived there and had adjusted his habit. He always drove in with his headlights on full. He always checked the mirrors before leaving his vehicle. He always walked Sadie to the elevator with her on his left side, furthest from the row of fire exits and stairwell doors that ran along the garage's eastern wall. He'd never had a reason to do more than note it, until tonight. Came down the ramp, headlights cutting across the concrete, and in the half-second sweep of that light, before his eyes adjusted, he saw them. 4 of them near the far fire exit. The door was propped. The buzzing overhead strip in that corner was dark, either dead or broken, and the pool of shadow it left was deep. But not deep enough. Derek's eyes found the configuration in an instant. 4 males, 20 to 25 range, loose posture but crowding posture, the specific geometry of a group that has positioned itself to prevent exit. And in the center of that geometry, pressed against the fire door, with her back against the metal, 1 woman. Natalie. He recognized her coat first, that dark green one she wore most mornings, and then the line of her shoulders, and then the way she was holding herself. He'd seen that particular tension in human bodies before. Not fear of a confrontation that might happen, fear in the middle of one that already had. His hands stopped on the wheel. 3 seconds. In 15 years of special operations, Derek Vaughn had practiced the discipline of the 3-second window. The window in which panic and action and paralysis all collide, and the only thing that determines which one wins is what you have trained into yourself so deeply that it lives below thought. Most people don't have those 3 seconds because they waste them, hoping the situation is not what it clearly is. Derek didn't waste them. He took in the whole picture, the 4 men, their positioning, the exits, the distances, the darkness on that eastern wall, and directly behind him in the back seat his daughter, still looking out the window, who had not yet seen what he had seen. A direct physical approach was tactically sound for one of him against 2 of them on open ground. 4 in an enclosed space with unpredictable variables, and his child 10 feet away, was a different equation entirely. But driving away was not an option. That thought arrived without deliberation, and he didn't examine it or argue with it. Some decisions aren't made so much as recognized. Sadie. His voice came out quiet, controlled, the voice he used when he needed her to listen without question. Turn from the window. Read him immediately. Dad. Put your seatbelt back on and get down on the floor. Don't look up until I tell you to. WhatsApp. Now, sweetheart. Right now. She didn't argue. She moved. He heard the seatbelt click and the soft sound of her lowering herself, and then he reached back without looking and found her shoulder and squeezed it once. He pulled his emergency phone from the center console and passed it back to her. Call 911. Tell them there's an assault in progress at the Calverton Heights Underground garage. Give them the address. Then stay quiet and stay down. Okay. Her voice was controlled too. She was her mother's daughter, even when she was afraid. Put the car in gear. What Derek did next was not reckless. That's an important thing to understand. Every element of what he did in the next 90 seconds was calculated, not performed in the adrenaline blur of someone who has stopped thinking, but executed by a man who was still thinking clearly and had determined that what he was about to do was the most effective option available to him with the variables at hand. He drove toward them. Not fast, not straight at them. He angled across the garage floor, his headlights swinging to point directly at the group, and he brought the SUV to within 20 feet before he hit the accelerator, a short, hard burst, engine roaring up in the concrete acoustics of the garage, and then braked sharply, the tires grabbing, the nose of the vehicle dipping. The effect was immediate. Two of the men lurched backward. One slammed into the fire door. The other spun toward the nearest pillar. Natalie pressed further back, but Derek clocked the change in her posture. In that fraction of a second, her head came up. Her eyes found the SUV, and something shifted from pure terror toward something else that wasn't yet relief, but was at least uncertainty about the outcome. He held the brake and let the engine sit at a high idle for 3 full seconds. Then he hit the high beams. The eastern wall of the garage flooded with light. The 4 men threw their arms up instinctively. In an enclosed underground structure, darkness is a weapon. It provides cover. Anonymity, the predatory advantage of controlling what your target can and can't see. Derek had just taken that weapon out of their hands. He held the horn. The sound in that concrete box was extraordinary, a sustained blast that bounced off every surface and arrived from every direction at once, disorienting, impossible to locate. He watched one of the men turn in a full circle, looking for exits. Then Derek cracked his window 2 inches. My dashcam has been running since I came down the ramp. His voice was flat and even, carrying exactly as far as he needed it to. Every face. Every second. The police are already on their way. Silence. One of the men, the one who'd been closest to Natalie, wearing a gray jacket, the one who had clearly been doing most of the talking before Derek's headlights arrived, stared directly at the windshield. Derek held his gaze without blinking. He'd looked across a lot of darkness at a lot of men in his life. He knew the exact moment when someone recalculated their odds and found them no longer favorable. He saw that moment happen. The man in the gray jacket looked at his friends. One brief exchange, nothing verbal. Then he turned and went for the ramp at something faster than a walk. The other 3 followed. Within 15 seconds, they were gone. Derek sat for another full count of 5, watching the ramp and the exits, confirming the space had changed. Then he put the car in park, turned off the engine, and opened the door. The garage was very quiet. Natalie was still against the fire door. She hadn't moved. He walked toward her at a deliberate pace, not hurrying, not charging. The same way you approach someone after an explosion. After you'd confirmed the immediate threat was neutralized, and the only thing left to manage was the human cost of what had just happened. She was shaking, not a little. Her whole body was running a current through it, hands pressed flat against the metal door, her breathing audibly unsteady. And when Derek got within 10 feet, she looked at him with an expression that he recognized not from past relationships, not from civilian life. He recognized it from the other side of missions. When you reached someone who had been held at the edge of something terrible and brought them back, and their body and mind were still arguing about which reality they were in. "They're gone," he said. He stopped 6 feet from her, gave her the space. "You're safe. The police are on the way." She looked at him, looked at the SUV, looked at the ramp where the men had gone. "Natalie," he said her name quietly. "You're safe." Her chin dropped. Her shoulders caved forward in one sudden movement, and her knees buckled. He moved. 2 steps, and he was close enough that when she came down, She came down into his arms rather than onto the concrete. He held her upright. She was light, lighter than he expected, and her hands came up and gripped his forearms, like she needed the confirmation that something in the world was solid. He let her hold on. Behind him, he heard the soft click of the SUV's rear door. Sadie came around the back of the car with her sneakers on the concrete and her face carrying the careful expression of a child who has processed something frightening and come out the other side with a sense of purpose. She walked up beside Natalie and, without saying anything, placed her small hand on Natalie's arm. Natalie looked down. Something in her face broke open. She made a sound, not words, just the sound of someone who had been holding something very tightly and could not hold it anymore, and she bent forward, and Derek kept his arms around her, and Sadie kept her hand on Natalie's arm. And the three of them stayed like that in the buzzing half-light of the underground garage, while somewhere above them, the city moved on, and somewhere in the distance, the first sirens began. Derek didn't say anything else. There wasn't anything to say. He just held her until she steadied. He was aware, in some part of his mind that was watching from a remove, that this was the closest he'd stood to another person in 3 years. That this was the first time his arms had held anyone who wasn't Sadie. He noted it, and then he set it aside, and he focused on what was in front of him. Good at that. He had always been good at that. The police arrived in 2 units, 4 minutes after Sadie's call. Derek heard the sirens first, the sound coming down through the concrete above them in that distorted way that underground structures do, arriving from everywhere at once before it arrived from anywhere specific. He'd already moved Natalie to the SUV by then, gotten her sitting sideways in the open rear door with her feet on the ground, which was the practical thing to do because her legs were still unreliable and the concrete was cold, and the alternative was having her stand against the garage wall, which he wasn't going to ask her to do. Sadie was beside her. She'd positioned herself there without being asked, sitting up on the edge of the seat with her shoulder touching Natalie's arm, not saying much, just present. Derek stood a few feet away facing the ramp, watching. He was still running the numbers, the way he always did in the aftermath of something. Not to process it emotionally, that was a different conversation, one he generally avoided having with himself, but because the operational side of his brain didn't have an off switch. The 4 men were gone. They'd gone up the ramp, which meant they'd either exited through the building lobby, which had a camera, or through the side door on the alley level, which also had a camera. The dash cam had been running since he'd turned into the garage. He'd confirmed this before stepping out of the vehicle. The footage would be clear. The lighting, poor as it was, had been supplemented by his high beams for most of the relevant time. He'd gotten faces. Those were the practical facts, and he organized them while he waited, because organizing practical facts was the thing he knew how to do. What he didn't organize, what he left in a drawer in the back of his mind, to be examined some other time, or possibly never, was the way Natalie had felt when she stopped shaking. The moment when she'd steadied and pulled back slightly and looked at him, and he'd seen in her face not the gratitude he'd expected, but something more complicated than that. Something that looked a little like embarrassment, a little like anger, not at him, at herself, maybe, or at the situation, or at the fact that she'd needed catching at all. He recognized that particular combination of emotions. He'd felt it himself after things. He left it in the drawer and watched the ramp. The uniforms came down in a sweep of flashlights and radio static, and Derek put his hands where they could be seen before either officer asked, which was the reflex of a man who had spent years operating in ambiguous circumstances and understood how first impressions worked when you were a large man standing near a woman in distress. "Sir, are you the one who called?" The officer was young, maybe 26, with the careful authority of someone who was still getting comfortable with it. "My daughter called. I was driving." Derek kept his voice level. "There were 4 men. I've got dashcam footage." The second officer had already moved toward Natalie and was speaking to her quietly. Derek watched from his peripheral without making it obvious he was watching. She was collecting herself. He could see it happening, the way she pulled her spine straight, set her jaw, answered questions in full sentences, even though her hands were still not entirely steady in her lap. She was the kind of person who defaulted to competence as a coping mechanism. He recognized that too. He'd spent 15 years around people like that. He'd been one of them. The men went up the ramp, Derek told the officer. 4 of them. Approximately 20 to 25, male. One was wearing a gray jacket. Heavyset, he was closest to the woman. My dashcam has them from the moment I came down the ramp. The footage will give you faces. The officer wrote this down. You said you drove at them? I used my vehicle to break up the confrontation without physical engagement. He paused. My daughter was in the car. The officer looked at Sadie, who was watching the exchange, with the attentive stillness of a child who had learned to read rooms. Then the officer looked back at Derek, and something shifted slightly in his expression, not softened, exactly, but recalibrated. We're going to need a statement from you, sir, and the dashcam footage. I know. Derek reached into the SUV for his phone. I can transfer the file right now if that helps. It helped. They spent the next 20 minutes going through procedure statements, footage transfer, the officer's radio calls going back and forth as other units started running the alley-level cameras and the lobby feed. Derek answered questions precisely and without elaboration, which was a habit, and watched Natalie across the garage do the same. She spoke clearly. She gave descriptions. She kept her voice from cracking even when she got to the part of her account where it clearly wanted to. Only once did she look over at him. It was brief. He couldn't read what was in it, and he didn't try. Sadie, eventually, leaned against Derek's arm and said nothing. She was tired. It was past 9 o'clock, and the adrenaline that had been carrying them both had gone out like a tide. He put his arm around her, and she leaned further in, and he felt her breath slow toward the rhythm of a child who is fighting sleep. We're almost done, he told her quietly. I'm not tired, she said. I know. She was asleep against his shoulder 4 minutes later. The police station was downtown, 12 minutes from the building, and neither Derek nor Natalie had been given the option of deferring their full statements until morning. That was fine. Derek preferred to get it done while the details were sharp. He'd learned a long time ago that memory was not a recording, it was a reconstruction, and every hour you waited was another hour for the reconstruction to drift. He'd arranged with one of the officers to let Sadie sleep in a chair in the break room with a blanket one of the female officers had produced from somewhere. Sadie had woken up enough to walk inside and then gone straight back under, her sneakers still on, her head tipped sideways against the wall. Derek had stood in the doorway for a moment looking at her before he followed the officer down the hall. The statement took 40 minutes. He was thorough, specific, and careful not to editorialize. He'd given statements before, in contexts that made this one look simple, and he knew the difference between what investigators needed to build a case and what was just a person working through their own feelings out loud. He gave them what they needed. When he came out of the interview room, Natalie was sitting in the hallway on a wooden bench, her hands wrapped around a paper cup of coffee that one of the officers had evidently gotten her, and she was staring at the floor with an expression that Derek recognized as the expression of someone whose body had run out of shock and was now just running on empty. He sat down on the bench beside her. Not close. There was 1.5 feet of space between them. She didn't look up. How's Sadie? Asleep in the break room. She was incredible, Natalie said, the way she stopped. Swallowed. She just put her hand on my arm and didn't say anything, and I completely fell apart. She has a gift for that. He meant it honestly. She gets it from her mother. Natalie looked at him then. It was the first time since the garage that they'd been at eye level with each other, and not in the middle of something requiring immediate management. She looked tired. Her mascara had done something imprecise under her eyes, and she hadn't bothered with it. Her hair was half pulled, from whatever she'd had it in when she left her office, and she was still stringing his jacket. He'd put it around her shoulders in the garage, and she'd apparently forgotten she had it on. I didn't know you had a daughter, she said. I mean, I knew. I'd seen you with her. I didn't know her name. Sadie. Sadie. She said the name like she was setting it down somewhere she'd be able to find it again. A silence opened between them. It wasn't uncomfortable exactly. It had the quality of a silence that follows something large, that is shaped by that something rather than by absence. You were Navy? She asked. He looked at her. I could tell. She wrapped her hands tighter around the cup. The way you moved. The way you talked to them. The way you talked to me after. She paused. You weren't trying to be impressive. You were just doing the next thing. Derek looked down at the floor. Navy SEAL. 15 years ago to 4 years ago. 15 to 4. I got out when my wife got sick. He said it simply. It was a fact. It didn't require architecture around it. Natalie was quiet for a moment. I'm sorry, about your wife. It was 2 years ago. She didn't push further. He appreciated that more than he could have expressed. After a moment, she said, "Can I ask you something?" And her voice had shifted slightly. Something more careful in it, something that sounded like it was carrying weight. It wasn't sure how to set down. Sure, tonight. In the garage. She turned the cup in her hands. When you drove at them, were you scared? He thought about it. He gave it the consideration it deserved rather than the reflexive response. Not of them, he said. She waited. Sadie was in the car. He kept his eyes on the middle distance. That was the only thing I was scared of. That I'd miscalculate something, and she'd be in the middle of it. Natalie absorbed this. But you did it anyway. She was already in the middle of it. Another silence. He could hear the station's ambient sounds printers, radio chatter, someone down the hall laughing at something. Ordinary sounds that existed in a separate universe from the concrete garage where tonight had happened. I've never, Natalie started, and then stopped, and he could see her deciding whether to say the thing she was deciding whether to say. I make decisions every day, big ones. I run a company with 240 employees. I've negotiated contracts worth more than I want to think about. I've fired people and hired people and told a boardroom full of men, twice my age, that they were wrong. She paused. I have never in my life felt as completely helpless as I felt tonight. She said it like a confession, like it cost her something to admit it. That's not a character flaw, Derek said. I know that. A beat. I know that logically. Knowing something logically and knowing it are two different things. She looked at him. That sounds like experience talking. It is. She held his gaze for another second and then looked back at her coffee, and he had the specific sensation of a door that had been opened a crack and then, not closed, but left open at that same crack, neither of them moving toward it or away from it. He stood up. I'm going to check on Sadie. Of course, she started to take off his jacket. Keep it. He said it before he'd thought about it. Cold in here. She settled back into the jacket and he went down the hall, and he did not examine what he was feeling because he was very good at not examining things. The 4 men were identified within 72 hours. Derek knew this because the detective who'd caught the case, a tired-looking woman named Patel, who had the professional demeanor of someone who had processed too much of the worst of human behavior to be surprised by any of it, called him Thursday. Morning to tell him the dashcam footage had been exactly what they needed. 3 of the 4 had prior records. The 4th was connected through those records. They had names. They had addresses. Miss Carrington's pressing charges? He asked. She is, Detective Patel said. She was very clear about that. We've made 2 arrests so far, 2 more expected by end of week. He thanked her and hung up and went back to his coffee. He thought about calling Natalie. He had her number from a building contact list the property manager distributed at the start of every year. It was listed there with everyone else's. Nothing special about having it. He looked at his phone for a moment and then set it face down on the kitchen counter and went to make Sadie's lunch. She was at school. The morning had been nearly normal: breakfast, backpack, complaint about the amount of homework misses. Keating assigned, but just before she went out the door, she'd stopped with her hand on the doorframe and looked back at him. Is Miss Carrington okay? I think so, he said. I don't know yet. Sadie considered this with the deliberate seriousness she applied to things that mattered. You should check on her. I'll think about it, Dad. I said I'll think about it. She gave him the look. The one that was her mother's. Then she went. He thought about it for the better part of the morning, and then sent a text message at 11:15 that said, Detective Patel called. 2 arrests so far, 2 more expected by end of week. Your footage was what they needed. Thought you'd want to know. He put the phone down and told himself that was sufficient. That was a neighbor passing along relevant information. That was appropriate. Her reply came 6 minutes later. Thank you. Talked to her yesterday. It helps knowing it's moving. Are you and Sadie okay? He read it twice. The question at the end was what stopped him, not the question itself, which was ordinary enough, but the order in which it was asked. Not are you okay, singular. Not a general how are you. She'd asked about both of them, named them in the right order, which was the order that mattered. He typed, yes. Sadie's fine. She actually hasn't talked about it much, which is either healthy or concerning. I'm not sure which yet. He almost deleted the second sentence, which was more than he'd intended to say. He sent it. Natalie. That sounds like a 10-year-old working it out in her own way. Or she's processing it better than we are. Derek looked at that for a moment. Then probably both. Natalie, probably. He set the phone down again. Felt like the conversation had ended in a reasonable place, and he was satisfied with that. And he went back to his work and got through the afternoon and picked up Sadie at 3:30. And that night after dinner, when he was loading the dishwasher, his phone lit up again. Natalie, I keep looking at the parking garage entrance from the lobby. I know they're not there. I know it's done. My feet just stop. He stood with the dishwasher door open. He typed, "That's your nervous system doing its job. It doesn't know it's over yet. It just knows something happened there." A longer pause this time. Then, does it stop? He leaned against the counter and looked at the kitchen window, at the dark outside it. He typed eventually. Different for everyone. But yeah. Natalie, you know from experience. Not a question. He considered how much to say, how far into the actual answer to go. Derek, I know from experience. Her reply took a moment. Okay. That helps. Good night, Derek. Good night, Natalie. He put the phone in his pocket and finished the dishes. He told himself nothing had changed. He was disciplined enough to maintain that position for about 2 weeks, which was longer than some men would have managed, and shorter than he would have liked. In those 2 weeks, a pattern assembled itself without any deliberate construction on either side, or at least that was what Derek told himself. They exchanged occasional messages, brief, functional, with the easy and uninflated quality of 2 people who were busy and didn't perform things they didn't mean. He passed along updates from Detective Patel as they came in. The 3rd arrest, then the 4th, the confirmation that all 4 men were in custody, and the case was moving toward prosecution. She sent back acknowledgments that were warm without being effusive, and once, when the 4th arrest came through, it sent good. I'm glad. Thank you for staying on top of this. You didn't have to. He'd written back, it's your case. You had a right to know how it was going. She'd replied, most people would have left that to the detective. He hadn't answered that one. There wasn't an answer to it that didn't open more than he was ready to open. In the building, they continued to overlap in the ways that residents of the same floor overlap, the elevator, the mailboxes, the lobby. But something had shifted in the specific texture of those encounters. They lasted slightly longer than before. The conversations went 1 or 2 exchanges further than pure neighborly courtesy required. Started asking about Sadie specifically, not in a general how is your daughter way, but in ways that suggested she'd retained details from previous mentions. That was the thing that unsettled him most, in the quiet accounting he did of it late at night. Natalie Carrington paid attention to things. He noticed when people paid attention to things, and he noticed it had become an occupational hazard in this particular case. It was a Thursday evening, 3 weeks after the garage, when it shifted again. Came down the lobby stairs and found her standing near the mailboxes in her coat, her work bag over one shoulder, looking at her phone with an expression that wasn't distress, but wasn't far from the neighborhood. She looked up when she heard him on the stairs, and something flashed across her face relief, almost at the specific identity of who was coming, before she arranged herself back to neutral. Hey, she said. Hey. He slowed his pace without making it obvious he was slowing it. Long day, she said, which was not quite an explanation for the expression he'd seen. You okay? She looked at the elevator. Just a look. She didn't answer, and she didn't move toward it. He understood. The elevator was 12 feet from the lobby entrance. The lobby entrance was 20 feet from the garage. The geography of it was still writing itself on her nervous system in ways she couldn't fully override yet, no matter how competent and clear-eyed she was in every other domain of her life. We can take the stairs, he said. She looked at him. I take the elevator every day. I know. I'm not going to let... She stopped. Hailed. I take the elevator every day. Okay? Neither of them moved for a second. But I also... She adjusted the strap of her bag. Today I'm tired. Stairs are this way. They took the stairs. They didn't talk much on the way up. It was 4 flights, and they were both carrying things. And conversation on stairs has a particular awkwardness that breaks rhythm. But they went at the same pace without coordinating it, and she didn't apologize for the stairs, and he didn't make anything of it. and when they reached the fourth floor and came out into the hallway, he held the stairwell door for her, and she walked through and said goodnight at her door, and he said goodnight at his, and that was that. Except Sadie had been standing in the kitchen doorway when he came in, and she had the expression of someone who had heard voices in the hallway and drawn conclusions. "Was that Miss Carrington?" "Yes." "Did you walk up together?" "We were both coming in from the lobby." Sadie turned back into the kitchen with the satisfaction of someone who has received exactly the confirmation they were looking for. "Sadie," he said. "I'm making hot chocolate," she said. "Do you want some?" He took a breath. "Yeah, fine." Yes. She made hot chocolate and didn't bring it up again, and Derek sat at the kitchen table and drank it and looked at the wall and understood with considerable clarity that his position that nothing had changed, that everything was contained, that the walls he'd built were as solid as they'd been before October, was becoming increasingly difficult to defend. He wasn't ready for it not to be defensible. That was the problem. He wasn't ready because there was a part of him that had spent 2 years constructing the logic of why ready was beside the point, why the question of his own heart was simply less important than Sadie's stability, less important than the quiet he'd built, less important than avoiding the specific devastation of losing someone again, which was a thing he knew in his body as well as he knew anything. But logic had a limited influence over certain processes. He knew that too. He finished the hot chocolate and got up and washed both their cups and turned off the kitchen light and went to check on Sadie, who was already in bed with a book she was pretending to read. He took the book out of her hands and set it on the nightstand and turned off the lamp. "She's nice," Sadie said to the ceiling. "I know. She looks at you like she's paying attention. Go to sleep, Sadie." She was quiet. Then, quietly, Mom would have liked her. He stood in the doorway for a moment, with his hand on the frame. Dark room, his daughter's breathing already slowing toward sleep. He went out and pulled the door halfway closed, and stood in the hallway and felt the full and complicated weight of that sentence settle over him like something that had been waiting a long time to land. He didn't sleep well that night. He stood at the kitchen window for a while, the way he used to in the early months after his wife died, looking out at the city lights, and not thinking about anything specific, just letting the weight of things be what it was, without trying to resolve it into something manageable. At some point he went to bed. At some point the night ended, the way nights do. And in the morning there was coffee to make, and a daughter to get ready for school, and the reliable structure of a day to move through, and Derek Vaughn moved through it the way he always did, carefully, deliberately, keeping his eyes on what was in front of him, and only occasionally, when he couldn't help it, letting his attention drift to the apartment across the hall and the woman inside it who was, without any grand gesture or declaration, gradually becoming harder to think around. November came in cold and gray, the kind of cold that didn't announce itself dramatically but simply arrived one morning and made clear it intended to stay. Derek noticed the change in Natalie before she said anything about it. That was the thing about paying attention to someone over months of small encounters. You built up a baseline without meaning to, a sense of how a person moved through their ordinary days, and when something altered in that pattern, you caught it, the way you caught a change in a room's air pressure. Not loud, just different. She'd stopped using the garage. He noticed it first because he was in the lobby one morning when the car service she'd apparently switched to dropped her at the front entrance instead of the building's side door, which was the closer exit from the underground parking level. He noticed it again 3 days later when she came in through the lobby carrying 2 bags of groceries, which meant she'd walked from the store on the corner rather than driven and parked below. He noticed it the 3rd time when he was bringing Sadie home from school and passed her in the lobby, and she was standing near the elevator with the particular stillness of someone who is waiting for something internal to resolve before they move. She got in the elevator when he and Sadie appeared. She was fine in the elevator with other people. He'd registered that. He didn't say anything. He wasn't sure what he would have said. What he did instead was a thing he couldn't have fully articulated or defended if pressed. He began, quietly and without announcement, to adjust. He started leaving for the school run 5 minutes earlier so that he and Sadie were coming back through the lobby around the time Natalie's workday typically ended. He started taking slightly longer at the mailboxes on evenings when he heard the lobby door. None of this was orchestrated in any conscious strategic sense. He would have denied that framing, and honestly, he wasn't certain it was wrong to deny it. It was more like water finding a level. He was moving towards something without deciding to move, and the something was the reliable presence of another person in the spaces where the day turned over. It wasn't a plan. It was an instinct, and he'd learned a long time ago that his instincts were worth listening to, even the ones he didn't fully understand yet. Natalie, for her part, noticed too. He could tell by the way she didn't mention it. 3 weeks into November, Sadie's school held a parent conference evening, and Derek went alone, the way he always went alone, sat across from Mrs. Keaton in a classroom that smelled like dry erase markers and construction paper, and listened to the assessment of his daughter. Bright, attentive, socially perceptive almost to a fault, occasionally prone to carrying other people's problems as though they were her own responsibility. "She's been a little distracted lately," Mrs. Keating said. She was a woman in her 50s with reading glasses she wore on a chain, and the patient frankness of someone who'd taught long enough to stop softening the edges unnecessarily. Not academically, her work is strong, but she's somewhere else sometimes. In her head. She had a difficult experience recently, Derek said. Nothing that involved her directly, but she witnessed something that scared her. Mrs. Keating studied him. "Is she talking to anyone about it?" "She talks to me." "Good." A pause. Does she have other adults in her life she connects with, aside from you?" Derek thought about Natalie's hand on Sadie's shoulder in the garage. Sadie's hand on Natalie's arm immediately after. He thought about the way Sadie had said her name in the car on the way to school last Tuesday, like it was a fact she'd established, the same way she'd reference a friend or a teacher just part of the landscape of her life now. "There's someone," he said. "A neighbor. She and Sadie have connected." "That's good," Mrs. Keating said. "She needs more than one anchor." He drove home thinking about that word. Anchor. The things that hold a person in place when the water gets rough. He'd thought, for a long time, that he was enough of that, for Sadie one strong anchor, reliably set. It hadn't occurred to him until right now, sitting in traffic on a November evening, that an anchor by definition held from one direction, and that was different from being held from multiple directions. And the difference between the two was the difference between surviving a storm and actually being stable. He didn't like the thought. He let it sit with him anyway. When he got back to the building, Sadie was with the neighbor down the hall, a retired teacher named Mrs. Okafor, who watched her occasionally. And when he picked her up, Sadie was halfway through a sentence of something that had happened at school. A disagreement with a girl named Priya that had apparently been going on for weeks in a low-grade way, and she carried the story all the way home and through dinner. And he listened and asked the right questions, and it wasn't until she was clearing the table that she stopped and said, without preamble, "I want to invite Miss Carrington for dinner." He picked up her glass. "We haven't done that before. We've also never had someone save a lady in a parking garage before," Sadie said. "Things change. That's not really—" He stopped. "We don't need to make a thing of it." Sadie put her plate in the sink and turned around and leaned against the counter with her arms crossed in the posture she'd developed recently that she probably didn't know was identical to one of his. "She took the stairs again tonight. I saw her in the hall when I was coming back from Mrs. Okafor's." He said nothing. "She doesn't take the elevator alone at night," Sadie said. "I've been watching. You've been watching. I notice things." "You do." He set the glass in the sink. "That doesn't mean we should." "Dad." She said it the way his own mother used to say his name when she was past the point of accepting his rationalizations. He'd always hated how effective that was. She's alone across the hall, and she doesn't want to need help, and you're standing in the kitchen pretending you don't notice any of it. He turned and looked at his daughter. She looked back at him with dark eyes that were patient and clear, and very, very much her mother's. "One dinner," she said. "It doesn't have to be a thing." He loaded the last plate into the dishwasher and closed it, and said nothing for a moment. "I'll knock on her door tomorrow," he said. "I'm not making promises about anything else." Sadie's expression didn't change much, but she uncrossed her arms. "Okay," she said. He knocked the following Saturday morning at 9:15, which was early enough to be casual but late enough not to be alarming, and he had absolutely no prepared speech, because any prepared speech he'd tried to formulate in the preceding 20 hours had sounded either overly formal or presumptuous or like something he'd read in a movie, none of which he was willing to be. Natalie opened the door in her Saturday clothes jeans, a gray sweatshirt, hair pulled back in a haphazard way that suggested she hadn't been expecting company, and she looked at him with a frank surprise that she didn't try to hide. "Hey," she said, "Sadie wants to know if you'd like to come for dinner tonight." He said it simply, the way he'd have delivered any other factual piece of information. "She's been planning it since Tuesday. There'll be pasta." She won't say what kind because apparently it's a surprise, which means she hasn't decided yet. Natalie stared at him for a half second. Then something shifted in her face, something that started at the corners of her mouth and moved upward, not quite a smile yet, more like the shape of one forming before it fully committed. "Pasta surprise," she said. "Yeah, what time?" 6. 6:30. Whenever works. She looked at him for another moment with that quality she had of paying attention to more than the surface of a thing. Then 6 works. "Can I bring anything?" "Sadie will say no, but she'll appreciate it if you do anyway." The almost smile became an actual one briefly, and then she said, "Okay." 6. And he said okay and went back across the hall, and that was that, except nothing was exactly that. Sadie, it turned out, had decided on carbonara, which Derek felt was ambitious for a 10-year-old, but she'd seen a video about it and had opinions about the egg-to-yolk ratio that she wanted to test. He supervised. The kitchen was a reasonable wreck by 5:30, and Sadie was wearing an apron that was too large for her and had egg on her forearm and was explaining to him in considerable detail why you had to take the pan off the heat at exactly the right moment, which she'd gotten from the video and was now presenting as though it were her own discovery. So, too, there was a knock. Natalie came in with a bottle of sparkling cider, noting, somehow, that Derek probably didn't drink much and that Sadie would appreciate having something in a fancy bottle and a small bunch of flowers that she gave to Sadie directly and not to the room in general, which Derek noticed. Sadie received them with the gravity of a child who has been given a gift she considers important. She put them in a water glass on the kitchen table because they didn't own a vase, and they spent the evening around that kitchen table with the flowers in the water glass at the center of it, which was imperfect and slightly lopsided and exactly right. Carbonara was good, not perfect, slightly too thick, and Sadie had overthought the timing, and it had seized a little but genuinely good, and they ate it and talked, and Sadie drove most of the conversation, because Sadie always did when she wanted something to happen, and knew that the adults in the room would overthink it if left to themselves. She asked Natalie about her company, not in a polite surface way, but specifically, what did they make? How did she start it? Was it hard to be in charge of that many people? And Natalie answered all of it directly, and without the edited for children quality that a lot of adults defaulted to, which Sadie registered and responded to by being even more direct in return. "Were you scared when you started it?" Sadie asked. "Constantly," Natalie said. "I thought I'd lose everything for the first 2 years. But you didn't. Not yet." She said it with a dry smile. "I try not to celebrate too early." Sadie considered this. "My dad is like that too. He never thinks something is finished until it's actually finished." Derek looked at his carbonara. "I've noticed," Natalie said, and there was something in her voice that wasn't quite directed at Sadie. After dinner, Sadie relocated to the couch with the authority of someone who has accomplished what she came to accomplish and is now comfortable leaving the rest of the evening to proceed without her management. She put on a nature documentary at low volume, pulled her feet up under her, and was effectively asleep within 40 minutes. Derek and Natalie sat at the cleared kitchen table with their cider, and the conversation shifted not to anything heavy, but to the lower, quieter register that conversations find when the child in the room falls asleep and 2 adults are left alone with the remainder of the evening. They talked about small things, the building's maintenance issues, a restaurant she'd tried recently and found disappointing, the documentary Sadie had selected, which was apparently about deep-sea creatures, and which had filled the apartment with ambient sounds of the ocean floor. Comfortable. That was the word for it, and it was also the word that made Derek the most uncomfortable. He'd forgotten what comfortable felt like with another person. Not the managed ease of professional interaction, not the deliberate pleasantness of being a good neighbor, but the specific comfort of sitting at a table at 9:15 on a Saturday night with someone whose company you weren't monitoring or measuring or holding at a careful distance. He noticed it with something adjacent to alarm. "Can I ask you something?" he said. She looked at him with the direct attention she always brought to things. "You can. The garage." He kept his voice even. "You're not using it." She held his gaze for a moment. He watched something move through her expression, not defensiveness. Exactly. More like the particular tension of someone who doesn't like being observed accurately. "I've been taking car service," she said. "I know." "And the stairs." "I know." She turned her cider glass in a slow half circle on the table. I'm not hiding in the apartment. I go to work, I go out, I function perfectly well." "I know that too. So I wasn't suggesting otherwise." He looked at her. "I was asking about the garage." She was quiet for a moment. Outside the kitchen window, the city made its constant background sound. On the couch, Sadie breathed slowly in the low light of the documentary. "I go down there in the mornings," Natalie said finally. "When it's busy. When other residents are coming and going. I can do it then." A pause. At night, she stopped. "My feet just stop. I know it's not rational. It's completely rational. It doesn't feel rational. That's because you're confusing rational with comfortable," he said. "Your brain learned something that night. It learned that specific place at specific conditions is dangerous. It's not wrong to have learned that. It's just still applying a rule that the situation no longer requires." She looked at him carefully. "You're very calm about this." "I've had similar experiences of being cornered in a parking garage, of places that stopped feeling safe." He kept his voice level. "Took me a while to understand that the place isn't the problem. What happened in it is the problem, and those are different things." She was quiet again, turning the glass. "Then, how long did it take?" "Depends on the place." He looked at the table. "There's a particular stretch of highway outside of Fallujah that I haven't driven since 2019. So I'm not exactly a success story." He said it flatly, without drama, the way he said things he'd made a measure of peace with without pretending they were entirely resolved. She looked at him for a moment, and then let out a breath that was almost a laugh, not at the thing itself, but at the honesty of it, the way it landed without trying to be anything other than what it was. "Fallujah," she said, "among other places. That's a different scale than a parking garage. Scale doesn't really matter to the part of your brain that's doing it," he said. "It just knows that place, that feeling. Size is irrelevant." She held that for a moment. "Does it help? Knowing that?" "A little." He looked at her. "What helps more is going back. Not forcing it. Just going back. When you can. At whatever pace you can manage, until the place starts being just a place again." She looked at the window. "You're saying I have to keep going through it. I'm saying you probably already know that." She didn't answer immediately. And then, "Yeah, I do." Sadie made a small sound in her sleep, shifted on the couch, and was still again. They both looked at her. "She talks about her mother sometimes," Natalie said, quietly enough not to carry. "When we're in the elevator. Just mentions her naturally, the way kids do. Like she's still very much present." Derek looked at his daughter. "The rise and fall of her in the dim light, she is. To Sadie, she is. And to you?" He didn't answer immediately. This was the edge of territory he didn't take people into. He knew that about himself, the specific coordinates of where he stopped, the internal fence line he'd put up and maintained, and occasionally caught other people looking at curiously without being able to explain why it was there. "She's Sadie's mother," he said. "She's part of everything. That doesn't change." "I'm not asking you to," Natalie stopped. "I didn't mean it as a question with a particular answer attached." "I know." He looked at her. "I'm not good at those." "At what?" "Questions without a particular answer attached." She held his gaze. "Most people aren't. They just pretend better." He looked at her and thought, not for the first time, that she was more perceptive than was strictly comfortable. And also that there was something about being perceived accurately that he had missed without knowing he'd missed it, the particular sensation of being seen by someone who wasn't constructing you out of what they wanted you to be, but was paying attention to what was actually there. He looked away first. "It's getting late," he said. "It is." She didn't move for a second. Then she stood and picked up her glass and carried it to the sink, and the practical ordinariness of the gesture a guest cleaning up, because that's what you do, settled something in the room. They woke Sadie gently, which took 3 attempts, and resulted in Sadie sitting up with her hair sideways, claiming she hadn't been asleep. Natalie crouched down to say goodnight to her at eye level, And Sadie, still mostly asleep, put her arms around Natalie's neck with the uncalculated ease of a child who has decided someone is safe. Natalie held on for a moment. Her eyes over Sadie's shoulder were careful. Derek watched and didn't say anything. At the door, Natalie pulled her jacket on and looked at him with a directness that had always been characteristic of her, but felt, tonight, more unguarded than usual. "Thank you," she said. "For dinner." For she gestured slightly, not completing the sentence. "Sadie planned it. I know who planned it. A beat. Thank you anyway." He held the door. She went across the hall. Her door closed. He stood in the quiet of his apartment for a moment, and then turned around and found Sadie watching him from the couch, with the blanket wrapped around her shoulders and the expression of someone who has done exactly what she intended. "Don't," he said. "I didn't say anything," she said. "You were about to." She smiled, and it was her mother's smile, that particular combination of warmth and mischief that had always made it difficult for him to maintain any position he was trying to maintain. "I was just going to say, I think the carbonara turned out good." "It did," he said. "Go to bed." She went. He turned off the kitchen light and the living room lamp and stood in the dark for a moment, listening to the building settle around him, and he thought about what Mrs. Keating had said about anchors, and he thought about Sadie's arms around Natalie's neck with no calculation behind them, and he thought about a stretch of highway in Fallujah he hadn't been able to drive in years, and about what he'd told Natalie. What helped was going back, when you could, at whatever pace you could manage. He was not, strictly speaking, only talking about parking garages when he said that. He knew that. He'd known it while he was saying it. The following week was ordinary in its way: work, school, the building's rhythms, the shortened afternoons of late November that turned the sky dark before 5 and made the city feel smaller and closer than it did in summer. Derek and Natalie crossed paths 3 times that he counted, which was not meaningfully more than before, but felt different in quality. She said his name when she saw him now. He'd noticed that. Not as a performance of familiarity, but as a genuine reflex, his name as punctuation, as acknowledgement, as the small confirmation that you know which specific person you're looking at. He'd started doing it back. On Wednesday, he was in the lobby at 6:15 when she came in, and she was moving differently than usual, not upset, but carrying something. Tiredness that went past the ordinary working kind. She had her work bag over one shoulder, and her coat not quite buttoned against the November outside, and she was looking at her phone with the blank expression of someone reading something they've already read 4 times and gotten nothing new from each time. "Bad day?" he said. She looked up. He watched her register that it was him and make a small involuntary adjustment, the way people do when they see someone who makes them feel, despite themselves, slightly less alone. "Board meeting," she said. "2 of my board members think the company's growth trajectory is too conservative, and they want to discuss bringing in outside capital." She said it with the flat affect of someone recounting a problem they've been managing internally for hours and are running out of capacity for. Which they're not wrong about. The trajectory is conservative. I made it conservative on purpose, because you don't want the outside capital. She looked at him. Because outside capital means outside opinions. It means someone else thinking they get a vote on decisions I've been making alone for 5 years. So it's not about the money. It's never about the money. She pushed a strand of hair back. It's about control. About whether what I built stays mine or becomes a committee's. He'd heard versions of this kind of calculation before, not in corporate contexts, but in contexts stakes of whose voice was deciding were considerably higher, and he understood the instinct beneath it. Without needing to understand the industry specifics. "What happens if you take the capital and it goes wrong?" he asked. "I lose the company. And if you don't take it and the growth stays conservative?" "I keep the company. I grow it slower." She paused. "I might fall behind competitors who move faster. But you keep it." She looked at him steadily.
"Yeah."
"Then you already know what you're going to do." She was quiet for a moment. The lobby was empty around them, the amber light of the overhead fixtures making the space feel warmer than it probably was. "I know what I want to do," she said. "That's not always the same thing." "Is it different in this case?" She thought about it. He watched her actually think about it, not perform consideration, but genuinely apply herself to the question the way she applied herself to things. It was one of the things he'd noticed about her earliest. before he'd let himself notice other things that she was honest in her thinking. She didn't dress up her conclusions. "No," she said finally. "Not this time." "Then you're okay." She let out a breath, and it was the closest she'd come in his presence to just putting something down. "I'm okay," she said. "Today was just long." They stood in the lobby for another few seconds in the not uncomfortable silence that had become their native language. And then she looked at the elevator, and he looked at the elevator, and she pressed the button. They rode up together. She was quiet, and he didn't feel it. On the 4th floor, she got off, and he got off, and she said goodnight, and he said goodnight, and they went to their respective doors. He went inside and stood in his kitchen and put the kettle on and thought about the board meeting he'd never know the details of, and the company she'd built alone, and the specific quality of her voice when she said it's about control, about whether what I built stays mine, and he thought about his own version of that, the things he'd held on to with both hands, not because they were perfect, but because they were his, because he'd built them out of the wreckage of something that had broken him, because letting them go felt too much like starting from nothing again. He understood her, he realized, in the ways that were underneath the obvious surface differences. He understood what she was protecting and why she was protecting it, and how hard it was to protect it, while also being aware that walls, whatever else they did, also kept things out. Kettle boiled. He made tea and didn't drink much of it. It was past 10 when he heard, through the wall that separated 4A from 4B, specific sound of someone in the adjacent apartment failing to sleep, not dramatic, not loud, just the subtle evidence of another person's wakefulness. The soft sound of footsteps, then quiet, then footsteps again. At the cadence of a person who is up at 11 on a Wednesday, for the same reason people have always been up at 11. Because the mind won't settle. Because the day left too much unfinished. Because sometimes the dark is just louder than the light was. He thought about the garage. He thought about what he'd told her, that the place isn't the problem. That going back, at whatever pace you can manage, was the thing. He thought about it for a long time. Then he went to bed, because there was nothing else to do with the night, and he lay in the dark and listened to the building breathe, and thought that the particular irony of giving someone advice you know to be correct is that it obliges you to consider whether you're applying it to yourself. He was not entirely sure he was. He was not entirely sure he was ready to be. But he was, for the first time in a long time, genuinely asking the question, not filing it away, not classifying it as irrelevant, just letting it sit in the dark of his bedroom, like a thing that deserved to be acknowledged, even if he hadn't figured out what to do with it yet. That was something. He wasn't sure it was enough, but it was something, and in the economy of where he'd been and how far he'd come, something was not a small word. December arrived the way it always did in the city, not quietly, not dramatically, but with the accumulated weight of a season that demands something from people whether they're ready to give it or not. The storefronts along the main boulevard lit up. The air took on that particular cold that was different from November's cold, drier, and more insistent, the kind that got into your coat regardless of how well it fit. Sadie started talking about the school winter concert with the focused urgency of a person who has a stake in an outcome and wants to ensure all relevant parties are prepared. Derek was not fully prepared. He was rarely fully prepared for anything Sadie considered important, because Sadie's definition of important had a scope he was still calibrating after 10 years. "You have to be there at 6:45, she told him at breakfast. "Not 7. 6:45 because the seats fill up, and if you're not in the 3rd row, you can't see the risers properly. I'll be there at 6:45, and dressed. Not in your work stuff." He looked at her over his coffee. "What's wrong with my work stuff?" "Fine. It's just..." She moved her spoon around her cereal in a way that meant she was navigating towards something. "Do you think Miss Carrington would want to come?" He set down his coffee cup. "She doesn't have to sit with you," Sadie said quickly, in the tone of someone who has anticipated a specific objection and pre-addressed it. "Could, just if she wanted to come see it. She could. Not a big thing, Sadie. I just thought, let me think about it." Sadie looked at him with the patience of someone who has learned that "let me think about it" from Derek Vaughn meant yes, eventually, if left alone. She went back to her cereal without pushing further, which meant she'd judged correctly that pushing further would close the door she'd just opened a crack. He thought about it for 3 days. He was thorough, the way he was thorough about things he was using thoroughness to avoid. He asked Natalie, on a Thursday morning in the hallway, both of them waiting for the elevator, when the asking felt more like information being exchanged than anything that required particular weight to be attached to it. Sadie's winter concert is Tuesday, he said, 6:45. She wanted me to ask if you'd like to come. Natalie looked at him. She wanted you to ask. Yes, and you? He held her gaze. I'm asking Arnie a beat. The elevator doors opened. They got in. I'll be there, she said. Tell her I'll be there. He told Sadie. Sadie received this information with a satisfaction so complete it was almost architectural she didn't celebrate. She just absorbed it into her internal model of how Tuesday would go and moved on to discussing whether it was appropriate for the concert to include both traditional carols and a jazz arrangement, which she had opinions about. Tuesday was cold and clear. Sadie was nervous in the way she got nervous, not visibly, not in any way she'd have admitted to, but quieter at dinner, slower in her movements, her attention turned inward to something she was working on inside herself. Derek made pasta because pasta was easy and reliable and didn't require him to think too hard, and they ate it mostly in the comfortable silence of a household that knew how to be quiet together. At 6:15, there was a knock. Natalie was at the door in a dark coat he hadn't seen before, her hair down rather than in the work configuration she usually wore, and she was holding a small wrapped thing that turned out, when Sadie opened it at the door without ceremony, to be a packet of the good-colored pens Sadie used for her drawings. Sadie looked at the pens, and then at Natalie, with an expression Derek had not previously seen on his daughter's face, something between moved and embarrassed at being moved, specific vulnerability of a child who has been given something exactly right and doesn't know what to do with how that feels. These are the Stedlers, Sadie said. I know. Natalie crouched slightly to be at her level. I saw the brand on the ones on your desk when I was over for dinner. You'd been using them down to the last bit. She paused. You should have the good ones. Sadie hugged her. It was fast. Arms around Natalie's shoulders and then released, and then Sadie was back inside going to get her coat, and Natalie stood up with the expression of someone who has been caught off guard by something they didn't account for. Derek looked at her from the doorway. Ready? Yeah, she said, and her voice was slightly less even than usual. Yeah, let's go. The school auditorium was crowded in that particular way of a December concert parents packed into folding chairs, the low roar of 100 simultaneous conversations, the smell of coffee from a table by the door that someone's parent organization had set up. Derek navigated them to the third row, because Sadie had been very clear about the third row, and they sat with Natalie between Derek and a couple he recognized from the second floor of the building. The concert was 45 minutes of the particular genre of event that is simultaneously ordinary and not ordinary, because children at these things are always ordinary. They forget their words. They come in a beat late. They look for their parents with the terrified hope of people who need to confirm someone is watching, and not ordinary, because there is something about a room full of children trying their best at something that resists being dismissed. He'd always felt that. He felt it more now, somehow. Sadie was in the second row of risers, and she found him with her eyes approximately 30 seconds into the first song. He gave her the small nod he always gave her. I see you, I'm here. She held it for a second, and then went back to the music. Beside him, Natalie was watching with the quiet attention she brought to things, and once, during a song Sadie had a brief solo moment in 2 measures, just her voice. Clear and slightly sharp on the high note, Derek heard Natalie exhale beside him, with something that was not quite some sound but was unmistakably feeling. He didn't look at her. He looked at his daughter. But he noticed. After the concert, Sadie found them in the lobby crush, with the flush of someone who has done a thing they were afraid of and come out the other side. She accepted Derek's arm around her shoulders for approximately 3 seconds before adolescent dignity reasserted itself. And then she turned to Natalie with the directness she always used with people she trusted. Could you hear the high note? I could hear the high note. Was it too sharp? Natalie considered this with the honesty Sadie always pulled from her. The first one was a little. The second one was right. Sadie absorbed this without deflation. That's what I thought, too. She paused. I'm going to say hi to Priya. Don't leave without me. Gone into the crowd, and Derek and Natalie stood in the lobby with the noise of 100 families around them. And there was a moment that had no particular content. They weren't talking. They weren't doing anything, but that had a quality to it that Derek recognized from the way certain silences feel in certain places with certain people, which is the quality of being somewhere you haven't planned to be comfortable and finding yourself comfortable anyway. She's remarkable, Natalie said. She has her moments. She has most of her moments. Natalie looked at him. You know that, right? That she's genuinely remarkable. Not in the way people say it about all children. Actually. He looked across the lobby to where Sadie was standing with a girl her age, both of them talking with the rapid intensity of people who have things to work out between them. Yeah, he said. I know. She gets that partly from you. He didn't answer. That's not a flattering thing I'm saying, because we're standing here together, Natalie said. I mean, she pays attention the same way you do. She looks at things directly. He was quiet for a moment. Then, she's better at it than I am. She doesn't close down afterward. Natalie looked at him. You close down afterward. He met her eyes. Sometimes, I've noticed, I figured you had. They stood with that between them, which was more than they'd explicitly said to each other before about the thing that was happening between them, which was also something they hadn't named. And the unnamed quality of it had been working as a kind of protection. He knew that. She probably knew that the way a thing you don't define is also a thing you don't have to take responsibility for. He was getting tired of that particular protection. He didn't say so. Not there, in a school lobby full of parents and children. But he felt the tiredness of it the way you feel a limit approaching, not with alarm exactly, more with the acknowledgement of a thing that is simply true. Sadie came back with her coat half on and her backpack over one shoulder and her social situation apparently resolved, and they drove home together, all three of them in Derek's SUV. And Sadie talked about the concert from the back seat with the analysis of a performer debriefing a performance, what went right, what didn't, what she'd do differently. And Derek drove, and Natalie asked questions from the passenger seat, and it was very ordinary and not ordinary at all. The garage. It happened the following Saturday, and it didn't happen dramatically, which was exactly how it needed to happen. Derek was leaving with Sadie for a weekend grocery run, the kind of errand that was entirely mundane, and that he'd been making a point to not alter his habits around, because altering habits was a thing he'd learned to be careful with, and they came down in the elevator and crossed the lobby, and Natalie was there. She'd come out of her door at the same time, which was not planned, and they met in the lobby with the slight surprise of people who expected to navigate the rest of a Saturday separately. Grocery run, Derek said. I need to go too. She held up her phone with a list open on it. I've been putting it off. Sadie looked between them with the serenity of someone watching a situation unfold, according to a plan she has been patient about. We're parked in the garage, Derek said, and then you can ride with us if you want. It's easier than the car service. Natalie looked at him. He looked back. He knew what he was saying, and she knew what he was saying, and the question between them was not about the grocery run. Okay, she said. They crossed the lobby, and Derek pushed open the side door that led to the garage stairs, and Natalie went through it without pausing, which was the first thing, and then down the stairs, and Derek went beside her without making anything of it. And Sadie was behind them, talking about whether oat milk was actually better for you than regular milk, or whether that was something people just said, which provided a running current of ordinary conversation that made the descending concrete stairs just concrete stairs, and the turn into the garage just a turn. She slowed for half a step when they came through the door. Derek slowed with her, matching the pace, not stopping, not calling attention. The garage was different in the daytime, not dramatically, but the fluorescent strips were more effective against the Saturday morning gray, and there were other cars, other sounds, the distant rattle of someone loading bags into a trunk 2 rows over. Just a parking structure. 3rd row, he said, because that was where the car was. They walked to the 3rd row. She stayed close to him, not clutching, not performing fear, just close, in the way of a person who knows where the solid ground is in a space they haven't yet fully reclaimed. He didn't move away. He didn't call attention to the closeness. They loaded into the car. Sadie climbed in the back and immediately resumed the oat milk question, now directing it at Natalie, who engaged with it with genuine consideration, while Derek backed out and headed up the ramp. When they came up out of the ramp and into the cold December daylight, Natalie let out a breath. He didn't comment on it. He turned onto the main street and asked Sadie which store, because Sadie had opinions about which store. Natalie sat in the passenger seat with her grocery list open on her phone, and after a moment she said, quietly enough that it was for him and not for Sadie, "Thank you." "For the ride." "Yeah," she said, "for the ride." He drove. They were in the grocery store for an hour and a half, which was longer than any of them had intended, but the kind of duration that happens when a 10-year-old has grocery opinions and the adults are not in sufficient disagreement about the extended stay to end it. Sadie had a theory about which bread was best and wanted to test it by reading ingredient labels, which took time. Natalie, rather than being impatient, crouched down and helped her read them. And Derek stood back in the bread aisle, watching this, his daughter, and this woman comparing ingredient lists with the focused collaboration of people taking something seriously together. And he felt a thing in his chest that he'd been refusing to name for the better part of 2 months. He named it. Then he put the bread in the cart and moved on, because the bread aisle of a grocery store was not the moment for anything further. They drove back. They went up in the elevator together with the groceries. At the 4th floor, Natalie got off with her bags, and Derek and Sadie got off with theirs. And they stood for a moment in the hallway in that way that had become their habit, the brief pause before the separate doors. Next Saturday, Sadie said, with the confident authority of someone scheduling an event on behalf of parties who have demonstrated they require scheduling. "Lunch. I'm going to make something that's not pasta." Natalie looked at Derek. He looked back with an expression that was the nearest thing he had to helplessness. "What are you going to make?" Natalie asked her. "I haven't decided. But it won't be pasta." "I'll be here," Natalie said. Sadie nodded, satisfied, and went inside. Derek stood in the hallway holding a grocery bag and feeling the particular quality of a moment that has more in it than its surface. "She's going to be a CEO herself," Natalie said. "She's going to be something," he said. "I'm not always sure what." Natalie smiled at that, not the almost smile, the real one, the one that reached all the way up. She went inside and her door closed, and Derek stood in the hallway for a second, and then went inside too and put the groceries away. The thing between them sharpened through December in the way that things do when two people are paying close attention, but not quite speaking directly, every conversation carrying more than its words, every encounter leaving a residue that the next one built on. It was slow, and it was not painless. He was aware, with increasing clarity, that he was not simply enjoying someone's company. He was doing something harder than that, and something more dangerous, which was beginning to trust someone with his actual interior, not the managed version he presented to the world, not the capable single father with the quiet life, but the actual man underneath those necessary constructions. That was terrifying. He didn't use that word. He would not have used that word about himself. But if you'd asked him to describe the sensation of realizing that another person had seen past your edges, and you'd let them the specific vertigo of that, impulse to retreat followed immediately by the awareness that retreating would cost something you didn't want to pay, that was as close as language got. There was an evening in the 2nd week of December, a Wednesday, when they ended up in the lobby at the same time again. This was happening more frequently, though he still wouldn't have characterized it as arranged, and instead of going upstairs, they found themselves at the corner table of the small coffee shop, 2 blocks from the building, sitting across from each other, with cups they hadn't planned to order, in a place they hadn't planned to go, because the weather had turned sharp, and there was a moment at the building entrance where Natalie had stopped and said, "There's a place just here," and he'd said, "Okay." The coffee shop was nearly empty on a Wednesday evening. It had the slightly worn quality of a place that had been there a long time and didn't feel the need to update its aesthetic. They sat by the window with the December street beyond the glass and talked for an hour and a half about things that were and were not what they appeared to be on the surface. She told him about the board meeting outcome. She'd held her position conservative trajectory, no outside capital for the current fiscal period. 2 board members had pushed back hard. She'd been courteous, clear, and immovable, and in the end the board had ratified her decision, because she had the votes. And after the meeting, one of the dissenters had stopped her in the hall and said he disagreed with her call, but respected how she'd handled it. "That felt better than winning would have felt if I'd handled it poorly," she said. "How you do something matters as much as whether you get the outcome." "You really believe that?" "I do." He wrapped his hands around the cup. It's harder. But yeah, she looked at him. Is that from the SEAL training or from something else? Both. He thought about it. The SEAL stuff taught me tactics. What happens in the field, when things go wrong, teaches you something different. You start to understand that the how of it is what you have to live with after. She was quiet for a moment. Do you miss it? The work. Parts of it. He was honest. The clarity of it. When you're in an operation, there's one thing that matters, and everything that doesn't contribute to that one thing falls away. That stopped. Civilian life doesn't have that. No, she said. It doesn't. There's more noise. More competing things. It's harder to know which things actually matter. She held his gaze. Do you know which things matter now? The question had weight in it that both of them were aware of. He didn't deflect from it, which itself was a departure. There were several deflections available. He could see them from here, and he chose not to take them. I'm getting clearer on it, he said. She held his gaze for a moment and then looked at her coffee. He watched the way she was sitting, the specific quality of her stillness, and he thought that she was doing the same thing. He was doing the same negotiation between what was safe and what was real. Between the things they'd built to protect themselves and the thing that was sitting across from each of them at a corner table in a half-empty coffee shop on a Wednesday night in December. I keep thinking, she said finally, about what you told me in the garage. After they left, she was looking at the table, not the practical things. The one thing you said before the police got there. What did I say? She looked up. Just that. You didn't say anything else. You just said I was safe. He said nothing. I've had people in my life tell me I was going to be okay, she said. In various circumstances, my mother, friends, people meaning well. And they said it and I received it and it didn't land the way that did. She paused. I've been trying to figure out why. He waited. I think it's because you weren't saying it to make me feel better, she said. You were saying it because you had assessed the situation and it was the accurate information. She looked at him directly. You were treating me like someone who could handle accurate information. He looked at her. You could, I could, a beat. You knew that before you knew me. I knew it in the first 60 seconds I met you, he said. In the elevator on move-in day. She looked at him with something that moved behind her eyes, something that came and went before it fully settled. That long ago. You didn't perform anything, he said. He stopped, because the sentence was going somewhere he hadn't planned to take it. Then he decided to take it anyway. You were just there. The way you actually are. I noticed that. The coffee shop was quiet around them. The street outside the window was doing what December streets do in the evening. The cold and the light, and the people moving through it in their coats. I noticed you too, she said, before the garage. I know. You do? You had 2 cups of coffee in the mornings, he said it simply. One for now, one for later. I spent about a week thinking the second one was for someone else before I worked it out. She looked at him for a moment. Then she laughed genuinely, the kind that surprised her slightly, that started in her chest and came out without being managed. He felt something ease in him at the sound of it, the way a place held under tension for a long time releases when something in it finally lets go. The second cup is always for the afternoon meeting, she said. I never eat enough at lunch and I crash around 3. I know that now. You've thought about this more than you've indicated. Yes, he said. He wasn't going to pretend otherwise. I have. She looked at him steadily, and he looked back, and between them was the whole accumulated weight of what the past several months had been the garage, the police station, the stairs, the dinners, the grocery store, the lobby encounters, text messages, the coffee tonight that neither of them had planned, and underneath all of it, the much longer weight of 2 people who had learned to protect themselves and were now sitting across from each other in the very particular vulnerability of not doing that. I don't know how to do this carefully, she said. I want to be honest about that. I've had relationships that ended badly because I was too much of something. Too focused, too inside my own head, too slow to prioritize the parts of life that aren't the job. She looked at the table. I know what my flaws are. I'm not in a position to promise they won't show up. I'm not asking you to promise that, he said. I know. She looked at him. Saying it out loud before anything happens feels better than pretending I'm uncomplicated and having you find out differently. I know your flaws, he said. I've been watching you manage them for 8 months. She blinked. That's either reassuring or alarming. I mean it as reassuring. He held her gaze.
I'm not uncomplicated either.
I have a daughter who is the first thing, every time, no exceptions. I have a history I don't talk about easily, and that shows up in ways I don't always predict. I closed down when I should probably stay open, and I loved someone very much and lost her, and I have not. He stopped. Let the sentence find its own ending. I have not fully understood yet what it means to let that be part of my story instead of the reason I don't have more of one. The words were out. He'd said them. He looked at the window because looking at her directly in the immediate aftermath was more than he was prepared to do. After a moment, she said, "That's the most you've told me about yourself in 8 months." "Yeah, thank you for that." He looked at her. She was looking at him with the specific expression of someone who has been given something real and knows the value of it and is not going to diminish it by overstating it. They sat for another half hour and talked about easier things, and then it was late, and they went back to the building and rode the elevator up and said good night at their respective doors. Nothing further happened. Nothing needed to. What had already happened was enough for one night. He went inside and checked on Sadie, who was asleep with her new Stedler pens on the nightstand and the colored cap of one of them on her pillow, which meant she'd fallen asleep in the middle of drawing something. He took the cap and set it with the pen and stood in her doorway in the dark. He thought about the word his daughter had said weeks ago, in the dark of her bedroom, in the voice she used, when she was speaking something true rather than requesting anything. Mom would have liked her. He stood there long enough to let the thought be what it was, not comfortable, not resolved, but real. His wife was real. His grief was real. And the woman across the hall was real. These were not competing truths. He was beginning slowly, imperfectly, without any map for it to understand that. He pulled Sadie's door mostly closed. He went to the kitchen and drank a glass of water and looked out the window at the December night. He was not ready. He was also running out of road on which to not be ready, and he knew it, and he thought that maybe those two things, not ready and knowing the time has come anyway, were not as incompatible as he'd always assumed. He set the glass in the sink. He went to bed. He slept. The Saturday Natalie had promised to come for lunch, the one Sadie had scheduled, with the confidence of someone who considered the calendar a tool rather than a suggestion, arrived with a light snow that wasn't quite committing to itself. Flurries that came and went and left the city, looking like it couldn't decide whether to be beautiful or just cold. Sadie was up at 7:30. Derek heard her in the kitchen at 7:45, which was earlier than she had any reason to be there on a Saturday, and when he came out she was standing at the counter with a cookbook she'd gotten from the school library open on the counter, reading it with the focused intensity she brought to things she'd decided mattered. "What are you making?" he asked. "Soup," she said. "Minestrone. It has 12 ingredients." He looked at the cookbook. "That's ambitious. It's not pasta." "It's not pasta," he agreed. "Put the kettle on." "Do we have 12 ingredients?" "We have 8. I made a list." She handed him the list. He looked at it. Celery, canned tomatoes, cannellini beans, vegetable broth. The rest were spices and things they had. He looked at her, and she looked back with the particular expression of a child who has already solved the problem of how this grocery gap will be resolved. "I'll go," he said. "I'll come. It's snowing. It's barely snowing." They went. The grocery store was 20 minutes there and back, and Sadie spent most of it consulting the recipe on his phone and cross-referencing it against the list with the methodical seriousness of a person who understood that preparation was the difference between a thing going well and going wrong. She was, Derek thought not for the first time, her mother's daughter in every way that counted, and his daughter in the ways that were harder to name. Back at the apartment, she began the soup. Derek watched from the kitchen doorway for a while, and then went to his room and sat on the edge of the bed and thought about the night before, not the coffee shop, which was 2 weeks ago now, but last night, which had been its own thing. He and Natalie had been in the lobby again, the kind of overlap that was no longer accidental, though neither of them had made it official, and she'd said something before going up that had stayed with him. She'd said, "I think I'm figuring out that I'm not as scared as I thought I was." And then she'd looked at him in a way that made it clear she was not only talking about the garage. He'd said, "Good," and she'd said, "Yeah, that was all." But it had been enough to lie with for a night, enough to sit with on the edge of his bed on a Saturday morning while his daughter made minestrone in the kitchen. He thought about what he'd told her in the coffee shop, the things he'd actually said out loud, the ones that had surprised him slightly in the saying of them. The way speaking something you've been carrying internally always makes it more real than it felt when it was only in your head. He had not fully understood yet what it means to let that be part of my story instead of the reason I don't have more of one. He'd meant it when he said it. He'd also not known entirely what doing that would look like. He was starting to. He went back to the kitchen to help Sadie with the celery. Natalie knocked at 12:15. She was in her off-duty clothes again, jeans, a soft dark sweater, her hair down, and she was carrying something under her arm wrapped in brown paper that was too large to be food and too flat to be a box. She handed it to Sadie first, at the door. "This is for both of you," she said. "But I think it's really for your wall." Sadie took it and looked at her father. He nodded. She unwrapped it at the kitchen table, carefully, with the deliberate patience she used for things she didn't want to rush. It was a painting. Not large, maybe 18 by 24 inches, done on canvas, a specific style of someone who was technically competent and also felt the subject rather than just rendered it. The palette was dark at the edges, deep charcoal gray, the blue-black of underground concrete, the particular artificial light of a parking structure. But in the center, moving through that darkness, was a vehicle suggested more than detailed, the shape soft, a wash of warm amber and white from the headlights cutting forward into the dark. And in that light, two figures, one larger driving, and one small visible in the back. Beside the vehicle, slightly off to the right in the light's edge, a third figure, a woman, standing rather than falling upright, the posture of someone who has just been steadied. It was that night, translated into something that wasn't that night anymore, that had become something else with a translation, not a record of what happened, but a statement about what it meant. Sadie stood very still looking at it. Derek stood behind her looking at it. "I took a painting class in college," Natalie said, from where she'd stopped near the kitchen doorway. Her voice was careful, the way it got when she'd put something of herself into a thing and was waiting to find out if it landed. "I haven't done it since. I started this one the week after the garage, and it took me a while to get it to a place where it said the right thing." A pause. It's not too much," Sadie said. She turned around, and her face was the face of a child working very hard to hold something she feels too large for. "It's exactly right." Natalie looked at Derek. He looked at the painting and then at her, and he said, "Yeah, it is." She let out a breath she'd apparently been holding since she walked in. Sadie put her arms around Natalie's waist, which was not her usual mode. Sadie was affectionate in specific and considered ways, not given to the casual physicality that some children wore easily, and Natalie held her back. One hand on her hair, and over Sadie's head she looked at Derek with an expression that was unguarded in a way he hadn't seen from her before. Not at the police station, not at the coffee shop, not in any of the months of their careful approaching. It was the expression of someone who has wanted something for a long time and is experiencing the slightly disorienting reality of being in the middle of it. He understood the expression. He was wearing his own version of it. "Soup," Sadie announced, releasing her. "It's been simmering for an hour. It should be ready." The minestrone was good. Not perfect. Sadie had added the beans too early, and they'd gone softer than intended. And she'd put in more oregano than the recipe called for, because she'd measured it wrong, and then made a command decision to commit rather than course correct. But good, genuinely good. Kind of soup that fills a kitchen with a smell that has nothing to do with performance and everything to do with the actual doing of a thing. They ate it with bread that Derek had bought that morning at Sadie's instruction, and they stayed at the table for a long time afterward, the way people stay when there's no reason to move, when the place they're in is better than wherever going somewhere else would take them. Sadie talked. She had things to say about the painting class she was considering joining at the community center, about a book she'd been reading that had a twist she'd seen coming, but that still affected her anyway, about Priya, with whom the long-running disagreement had finally resolved into something approaching a real friendship, which Sadie analyzed with the clinical interest of someone who finds human social dynamics genuinely fascinating. Natalie listened and responded, and asked the kinds of questions that made it clear she was actually tracking the details and not just performing interest. Derek watched the two of them and ate his soup and felt something he was not going to name in the middle of lunch, but that was present and clear and not going anywhere. At some point, Sadie said she was going to her room to draw, which was plausibly true and also transparently an orchestration. And she took herself away with the smooth efficiency of someone executing a plan they've had for a while. Derek and Natalie sat with the remainder of the bread and the afternoon light coming in through the window and the snow out still doing its tentative thing. She's been waiting for this for months, Natalie said. She has. He picked up his water glass. She's patient when she thinks patience will work, and when she thinks it won't. Less patient. He looked at the table. She told me you paid attention to me the way someone pays attention to something that matters. She said it in October, around the time she first started pushing for you to come to dinner. Natalie was quiet. She was right, he said. She looked at him. Derek, I'm not good at going around to things, he said. I'm going to just say it. He looked at her directly because he'd decided that looking away was its own kind of dishonesty. I've been falling in love with you since before the garage. I didn't let myself understand what it was because I had good reasons not to, and I'm not sorry I took the time I took. But I know what it is now, and I'm not interested in pretending otherwise. Kitchen was very quiet. Natalie looked at him with those eyes that always saw past the surface of what he was presenting, and he let her see past it, didn't close anything down, didn't manage his expression into something more neutral, just sat there and let what was true be visible. I noticed you the second week I lived here, she said. Her voice was level, but not casual about it. You were in the lobby with Sadie, and she'd said something that made you laugh, I don't know what, and you looked at her like she was the most important thing in any room you'd ever been in. And I thought, she stopped, I thought, that's a person who knows how to love something. He didn't say anything. And then I thought, that's a person who's not available to love anything else. And I accepted that and told myself to stop noticing you. She looked at her hands. I was not particularly successful. I know, he said. I could tell. She looked up. You could tell. You made eye contact in the elevator for about 2 weeks straight and then stopped cold. I figured you'd made a decision. She stared at him. And you didn't say anything. I hadn't made my own decision yet. When did you make it? He thought about it. About the garage, about the police station, about the stairs and the groceries and the concert and the coffee shop. About Sadie's voice in the dark. Mom would have liked her. About standing at the kitchen window at 11 at night, listening to the building breathe, and asking himself whether he was applying his own advice to his own life. I made it gradually, he said, and then all at once. Both. She held his gaze. I'm not easy to be with, she said. I want to keep saying that. I work too much. I get inside my head for days at a time about things that are happening at the company, and I'm not great at pulling myself out of it. I have opinions about things that people find exhausting. Natalie. And I haven't been in a relationship in 3 years because the last one ended with the other person telling me that being with me was like being with someone who was always partly somewhere else. Natalie, she stopped. I know, he said. I've been watching you for 8 months. I know what you're like. I'm telling you I want this anyway. She sat with that. I'm not easy either, he said. I closed down. I hold things too long before I let anyone near them. I have a daughter who is the first priority in every situation, which means anything between us will have a specific shape that is non-negotiable. Carry things from my service years that I don't always know are still in me until they show up somewhere. And I loved my wife. He said it without flinching from it. It doesn't go away. That's part of me. It's part of Sadie. Anyone who comes into this family inherits that. She looked at him steadily. I know, you know. I'm saying it out loud so there's no version of this where you find out later and feel like I wasn't honest. She was quiet for a long moment, the kind of quiet that isn't empty, but full of the weight of two people who have been honest with each other and are now sitting in the space that honesty opens up, which is less comfortable than the space before it and also the only real place. Okay, she said. Okay, what does this look like? She asked. Practically. What are we saying here? We're saying we stop pretending we're just neighbors. He looked at her. We take it at whatever pace makes sense. We don't make promises about things we can't predict. We're honest when something's wrong. He paused. And we include Sadie in what this is, because she's already in it whether we include her officially or not. Natalie almost smiled at that last part. She really is. She's been in it since October, when she put her hand on your arm in the garage. I know, her voice softened slightly. I knew then too. What did you know? She looked at the table and then at him. That she was already someone I cared about. Not because of who her father was, just her herself. She paused. That scared me more than anything else about this. He understood that. He understood it completely and didn't need her to explain the architecture of it, the specific fear of caring about a child, which is a different category of vulnerability than caring about an adult. Because children don't protect themselves from you, they just open, and the absence of their defenses requires you to be more careful with yourself than most people know how to be. She can take care of herself more than you think, he said. But she also, he stopped. She needs this. I've been telling myself I was protecting her by keeping everything contained. I think I was protecting myself. Natalie looked at him. You were probably doing both. Probably. That's allowed. She held his gaze. That's just being human. He looked at her, and for a moment there was nothing to say, and nothing needed to be said. And then from down the hallway came the entirely transparent sound of Sadie, failing to be subtle about listening at her door. Derek looked at the hallway. Sadie, he said. A pause. I'm drawing, she called back. You're in the hall. Another pause. Then the sound of her door opening fully and her footsteps, and she appeared in the kitchen doorway with her sketchpad under her arm and the expression of someone who has been caught doing something they don't entirely regret. How long have you been there? Derek asked. Not long. Sadie. She looked at Natalie. Natalie looked back. Something passed between them, the specific current of two people who understand each other past language. Long enough, Sadie said. He rubbed his face with one hand. Sit down. She sat. She put her sketchpad on the table with the composure of someone taking a meeting they've been preparing for. So Derek said, You heard. Most of it. She looked at him. The important parts. He looked at Natalie. She was watching Sadie with an expression he'd learned to read over these months, the one that meant she was moved and was managing it. Are you okay with this? He asked his daughter, with what's changing. Sadie considered the question. He gave her time, because she deserved time, because this was her family being asked to make space for something new, and he was not going to minimize the size of that ask by rushing past it. I've been okay with it since October, she said finally. I've been waiting for you to catch up. The sentence landed with the precise accuracy that Sadie's sentences sometimes had, the ones that cut through to the exact center of a thing and said it plainly without cruelty. Derek sat with it and let it be true. Your mother, he said, carefully, honestly. This doesn't... Dad, Sadie looked at him with the patience of someone who has thought about this longer than he'd realized. I know, it's not instead of. It's also, she looked at Natalie. Mom would have been... She stopped, and for the first time in the conversation she looked young, the specific youngness of a child navigating a feeling that's bigger than her years and managing it anyway. She would have liked you. I know that. Natalie reached across the table and put her hand over Sadie's. Sadie looked down at it and then nodded once, the small decisive nod she used when something had been settled. And then she picked up her sketchpad and said she was going to finish the drawing and left them to the kitchen and the remaining bread and the winter light. January came, and things were different in the ways that mattered, and similar in the ways that made the difference sustainable. Natalie did not move across the hall. Neither of them moved toward the other dramatically, or with the urgency of people who have been waiting and are now making up for lost time. What happened instead was a gradual and honest integration, the kind that is built from small accumulations rather than grand gestures. From the Tuesday nights, Natalie started having dinner with them. From the Saturday mornings that became their natural time. From the way Derek stopped thinking of her apartment as across the hall and started thinking of it as hers, which was a different thing. The four men were tried in February. The case had been solid from the beginning. Derek's dashcam footage, the building's surveillance, the prior records of 3 of the 4 defendants, Detective Patel's careful assembly of the evidence. Natalie was present for every hearing she was required for, and several she wasn't. She gave her testimony clearly and without drama, the way she did things, and Derek sat 3 rows back in the gallery, with his hands folded and watched her and felt the quiet, steady pride of someone who has seen a person at their most terrified and is now watching them be their most controlled. All 4 were convicted. Natalie called him from the courthouse steps after the verdict, before she'd even gone back inside. Done, she said. Done, he said. How does that feel, she asked. He thought about it honestly, like a door closing. Not a celebration, just closed. Her voice was quieter. That's what it feels like. You okay? I'm very okay. Pause. Are you at the building? Just pulling in. I'll be home in an hour. Tell Sadie, she's at school. Tell her when she gets home. She's been asking me every day for a week, he told Sadie. Sadie received the news with the same single decisive nod she'd given at the kitchen table in December, settled and went back to her homework, which was the most Sadie way to respond to something that had already been resolved internally before the external confirmation arrived. It was March when Natalie came to Derek with something she'd been carrying for a while. He could tell she'd been building toward it for a few days, a quality in her that he knew now. The way she got slightly quieter when she was organizing her thoughts around something she didn't know how to open with. He didn't press. He waited, which was also one of the things she'd said she valued about him, in the direct way she said things she valued, that he didn't fill silence with questions. She came on a Sunday evening, after Sadie had gone to bed, and sat at the kitchen table where they'd had the first real conversation about what they were. And she put her hands flat on the table the way she did when she was going to say something without softening it. I want to tell you something about why my last relationship ended, she said. Not the version I told you before, the whole version. He sat across from her. Okay, it wasn't just that I worked too much. She looked at the table. It was that when things got difficult between us, when there was conflict, when something was wrong, I went away. Not physically, inside. I'd go into my own head, and I'd be solving the problem in there. And he'd be trying to reach me from the outside, and I'd feel the reaching, and I'd close off more. Because I didn't know how to let someone in when I was in the middle of working on something hard. Derek said nothing. He was listening. I did it to him for 2 years before he named it. And when he named it, I understood immediately that he was right, and I also understood that I didn't know how to stop doing it. She looked up. I've been thinking about it since things changed between us. Because I don't want to do it to you. A pause. And I probably will. At some point. I'll go inside and you'll feel me close off, and I need you to know that it's not about you. It's a thing I do. He looked at her steadily. When that happened, she said, would you... She stopped. He could see the cost of the ask before she asked it. Would you be willing to just say my name? The way you did in the police station parking lot. Just say my name and wait. Don't push. Just say it. He thought about what she was asking. He thought about the 2 ways it could be heard as a request for patience, or as something larger, which was a request to be seen in one of the specific ways she was hard to love and loved anyway. Yeah, he said. I can do that. She held his gaze. That's it? No questions about it. No, Natalie. He said it the way she'd described level, direct, present. I've closed down in the middle of things for 4 years. You've been patient with the version I've shown you. We're going to be patient with each other. She looked at him for a long moment. Okay, she said. Okay. She put her hand on the table and he put his on top of it, and they sat like that for a while in the kitchen that had become, without any formal declaration, the place where the real conversations happened. Spring came slowly that year, the way it does sometimes, ceding ground to winter and then taking it back, the mornings still cold while the afternoons ran warm. The trees doing their cautious emergence as though they didn't quite trust the season yet. Derek understood that particular caution. He also understood with increasing conviction that caution had its uses and its limits. There is a thing that happens to people who have survived loss, genuine loss, the kind that rearranges the furniture of who you are, which is that they develop a heightened sensitivity to the value of things. This can work against you. It can make you grip too hard, protect too fiercely, mistake the tightness of your grip for the strength of what you're holding. Derek had done that. He could see it clearly now in the way you can only see things when you're standing on the other side of them. He had loved his wife. He had lost her, and it had broken something in him, and he had built the breakage into a structure, called it wisdom, called it responsibility, called it protecting Sadie, when some of it was simply the very human fear of breaking again. There was no shame in that. He'd carried it long enough to know. It was also no longer the whole truth of who he was. He was still Sadie's father. He was still a man who'd carried too much in silence for too long. He was certain. He was still on certain nights the person standing at the kitchen window at 2 in the morning, holding the weight of things he didn't have words for. He didn't stop being those things, but he was also increasingly someone who had dinner on Tuesday nights with a woman who challenged him to think about things more carefully than he would have alone. Someone who had come to know a person's rhythms, the way she worked through a problem versus the way she worked through a feeling, which were entirely different processes, the way she laughed at things she didn't expect to find funny, the way she held Sadie with a steadiness that wasn't performed or constructed, but was simply who she was with a child she'd come to love. You do not plan for that. You do not see it coming. Not really. You think you are protecting yourself from exactly this kind of thing, and then it is simply there, already grown, and the only question is what you do with it. What Derek Vaughn did was this. He stopped pretending he was not in it. He said what was true. He remained. He was imperfect at both of these things, imperfect in the specific ways he'd warned Natalie he would be, and she was imperfect in the ways she'd warned him. And together they were imperfect in the way that two people learning each other are always imperfect, stumbling through the particular dark of another person's interior, trusting the stumbling to eventually find its footing. Sadie watched all of this with the quiet satisfaction of someone who has understood the outcome before the other participants. She did not say "I told you so" because she did not need to. She simply incorporated Natalie into the working understanding of her life with the same practical grace she brought to everything, and in doing so, made it easier for her father to do the same. She showed Natalie her drawings, all of them, including the early ones she'd never shown anyone. Natalie sat on Sadie's bedroom floor one Saturday afternoon and went through them with the specific seriousness that Sadie required, not effusive praise, not the flattening of a real child's real work into something generically wonderful, but genuine engagement, genuine response, the occasional honest observation that something wasn't working and why, which Sadie received the way she received all honest information, with gratitude. Derek stood in the doorway and watched them and did not say anything. There are moments in a life that you don't have words for in the middle of them. The language for them comes later, or sometimes it doesn't come at all, and you simply carry them as something wordless, a feeling you return to when you need to remember what the point of things is. That was one of those moments. His daughter on the floor of her bedroom with her drawings spread around her, showing them to someone she trusted. The afternoon light, the sound of their voices, the ordinary, extraordinary fact of this being his life now, this being what he had come to. He had come to it through a parking garage on a cold October night, through fear and restraint and the specific courage of a man who used his headlights instead of his fists, through months of careful proximity and careful honesty, and the accumulated weight of small true things said between two people who could have continued pretending indefinitely and chose, eventually, not to. He had come to it through grief that hadn't left, and love that had returned anyway. Which is the thing about grief, that the people in the middle of it rarely believe that it makes room eventually. Not by shrinking, not by being resolved, but by becoming something you carry differently, something that is part of you and not the enemy of your future. He had come to it because his daughter had seen something he'd been refusing to see and had been patient enough to let him come to it himself, which was the most generous thing one person can do for another. He was 37 years old. He had been a Navy SEAL and a widower and a single father and a man who'd spent 4 years convinced that quiet and contained was the most honest version of his life he could offer his daughter. He had been wrong about the last part, and the wrongness of it had cost him time he would not get back, and also because nothing is simply loss, had made the arriving at this place feel exactly as significant as it was. He was not a man who arrived anywhere easily. He was not a man who opened without considerable effort, without the specific internal negotiation of someone who knows what loss feels like and has built accordingly. He would not, going forward, be any different in the fundamental architecture of who he was. But he would be going forward, less alone in it, and Sadie would be less alone. And across the hall, though perhaps not across the hall much longer, conversation that was beginning to take shape in the space between them, the way things take shape before they're named Natalie Carrington, would be building her company and fighting her board and closing off when she got overwhelmed, and coming back out of it when someone she trusted said her name and waited. They were not a perfect story. They were not a simple one. They were three people who had found each other in the specific way that people find things in the dark, not by looking in the right places, but by following the light that was already there, the particular amber warmth of a set of headlights cutting through a concrete underground and illuminating exactly what needed to be seen. Some things you don't find by searching. Some things find you in a parking garage on a Tuesday in October, when you come down a ramp with your daughter in the back seat and your headlights sweep an eastern wall, and you recognize, in the half second of that light, that the life you've been so carefully protecting was also the life you'd been holding yourself back from. The SUV is still in the same spot in the third row. Sadie walks past it every day without stopping, and Natalie Carrington parks her car one space over now and gets out, and walks through the underground garage with the particular ease of someone who has reclaimed a place that was taken from her. Because reclaiming things you've lost is not about forgetting what happened there, it is about refusing to let what happened there be the last word. That is the thing worth saying. Not that everything works out, because it does not always work out. Not that love fixes what is broken, because it does not work that way and never did. But that the walls we build after loss, however necessary they felt in the building, were never meant to be permanent, and that the bravest thing a person can do, after surviving something that taught them how much there is to lose, is to decide that what there is to lose is exactly the reason to try again. Derek Vaughn had spent 15 years learning how to be effective in the dark. It turned out the most important thing the dark ever showed him was the light he was already carrying. He just had to be willing to turn it on.